why Louis XVI didn't escape, and why Marie Antoinette convinced him to stay. The darkness that draped over the Tuileries Palace on the night of June 20th, 1791, was not the peaceful slumber of a city at rest, but the suffocating silence of a cage. Inside these stone walls, a man who had once been considered a living god on earth, the Sun King's descendant, sat in the flickering candlelight of a world that no longer recognized his divinity. King Louis XVI, a man of simple tastes and a complex, heavy heart, watched the shadows dance across the floor of his study. He was the absolute monarch of France, yet he was a prisoner in the very heart of his capital. Outside, the pulse of the revolution beat with a frantic, hungry rhythm. The National Assembly had stripped him of his powers. The people had marched him from the splendor of Versailles to this damp, draughty palace in Paris, and the air itself seemed to thick with the scent of rebellion and the looming threat of the unknown. But tonight, the king intended to take back his destiny. He had a plan, a military escort waiting in the distance, and a clear path to the border where loyalist troops and the might of the Holy Roman Empire stood ready to restore his crown. He held the keys to a forged future, a chance to whisk his wife and children away from the rising shadow of the guillotine. Everything was prepared for a desperate, lightning-fast flight to freedom. Yet, as the clock ticked toward midnight, the seeds of a catastrophe were already being sown, not by his enemies in the streets, but by the very woman he sought to protect. To understand why Louis XVI did not escape that night, one must look past the political maps and the military strategies and peer into the fractured psychology of the royal family itself. For 2 years, the king had played a dangerous game of concessions. He had watched the Bastille fall. He had seen the heads of his guards carried on pikes, and he had signed decree after decree that slowly bled his authority dry. He was a man who hated conflict, a king who wished to be loved by a people who were increasingly learning to hate him. But by the summer of 1791, even his legendary patience had reached its breaking point. The king felt his soul was in danger. The revolution had forced him to accept the civil constitution of the clergy, an act that effectively turned the Catholic Church into a department of the state. For a man as deeply pious as Louis, this was the final straw. He could no longer remain a puppet in a play written by radicals. He needed to reach the fortress of Montmédy, near the border of the Austrian Netherlands, where General Bouillet and 10,000 loyal soldiers waited. From there, he could negotiate from a position of strength or, if necessary, reclaim his kingdom by force. But a king does not simply walk out of a palace guarded by the National Guard. The escape, known to history as the Flight to Varennes, was a masterpiece of clandestine planning, orchestrated largely by the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, a man whose devotion to Queen Marie Antoinette was as legendary as it was mysterious. Fersen knew the risks. He knew that the city of Paris was a tinderbox. Every gate was watched, every suspicious movement reported. For the plan to work, speed was the only ally the Bourbons had. Fersen had proposed a strategy based on agility. The royal family should split up and travel in small, nondescript, fast-moving carriages called cabriolets. These light vehicles could fly across the French countryside, changing horses in minutes and blending into the nocturnal traffic of the kingdom. It was a plan built for survival. It was a plan that recognized the reality of their situation, that they were fugitives in their own land. However, the reality of being a fugitive was something Marie Antoinette could not or would not accept. The Queen of France, the daughter of the great Maria Theresa of Austria, was a woman forged in the fires of the most rigid court in Europe. To her, the crown was not just a political office, it was an ontological state of being. The idea of the royal family of France scurrying across the border in separate cramped carriages, like common merchants or disgraced servants, was more than a logistical hurdle. It was a spiritual insult. She refused to be separated from her husband and children. More importantly, she refused to arrive at a foreign court looking like a defeated refugee. She insisted that they travel together, as a family, in a manner that befitted their rank. She convinced Louis to abandon the fast, light carriages in favor of a custom-built masterpiece of luxury, a grand berline. This carriage was a monster of wood, leather, and iron. It was painted a vibrant green and yellow, upholstered in white velvet, and equipped with every luxury imaginable, including a leather commode and a wine chest. It was designed to carry the entire royal family and their attendants in a single slow-moving bubble of Versailles-style comfort. It was a rolling palace, and like the monarchy itself, it was heavy, conspicuous, and tragically slow. The Queen's insistence on maintaining the dignity of the crown was the first and most fatal link in the chain that would lead to their ruin. She spent weeks obsessing over the details of their travel trunks, insisting on packing fine clothes, perfumes, and silver dinnerware. To Marie Antoinette, the escape was not just a flight for life. It was a royal procession that happened to be secret. She could not see that the world had changed, that the dignity she so desperately clung to was the very thing that would make them easy targets. As the midnight hour approached on June 20th, the tension inside the Tuileries reached a fever pitch. The king's sister, Madame Elisabeth, the royal children, and their governess, Madame de Tourzel, began to slip out in disguises. The governess was to play the role of a Russian aristocrat, the Baroness de Korff. The king's children were her daughters, and the king himself was to be disguised as her valet Durand, wearing a plain grey coat and a wig. Marie Antoinette took the role of the governess. It was a charade that might have worked if they had moved with the urgency of the hunted. But even the departure was delayed. The king, ever the creature of habit, insisted on finishing his dinner and engaging in his usual routines to avoid suspicion. When they finally began to move through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, the sheer size of their party and the weight of their baggage slowed them down. Outside, Axel von Fersen was waiting with a small carriage to ferry them to the outskirts of the city, where the great berlin sat ready. One by one the royals emerged from the shadows. The Queen, however, nearly ruined everything before they even left Paris. Unfamiliar with the streets of the city she had ruled for years, she became lost in the maze of alleys near the palace. For nearly an hour, the Queen of France wandered in the dark, her heart pounding beneath her commoner's disguise as she narrowly avoided patrols of the National Guard. When she finally reached Fersen and the waiting king, the schedule, a schedule calculated to the minute to coordinate with military relays along the road, was already in tatters. When they finally reached the massive berlin at the city gates, the sheer absurdity of their situation should have been apparent. The carriage was so large and heavily loaded that it required 6 powerful horses to pull it, and even then it could only manage a fraction of the speed of a lighter vehicle. But as the wheels began to turn and the city of Paris faded into the distance, a sense of misplaced relief washed over the royal family. Louis, looking out the window at the rolling fields of his kingdom, reportedly felt a surge of confidence. He believed that once he was away from the mobs of Paris, his good people in the countryside would rise up and cheer for him. He did not realize that the revolution was not a local riot, but a fire that had consumed the very foundations of the country. As the sun began to rise on the morning of June 21st, the berlin moved sluggishly through the Champagne region. The king, feeling increasingly secure the further he got from the capital, began to take risks that defied all logic. He stepped out of the carriage at several stops to stretch his legs and talk to the locals. He was a man who had spent his life being recognized, and despite his valet's disguise, he made little effort to hide his distinctive Bourbon features. He felt that he was among friends. He did not see the suspicious glances of the postmasters, or the way the news of a mysterious luxury carriage was traveling faster than the carriage itself. The Queen, too, remained locked in her world of royal entitlement. expecting the same deference she had always received, even while wearing the clothes of a servant. The delay caused by the heavy carriage and the late start began to create a domino effect of disaster. Along the route, detachments of hussars and dragoons had been stationed by General Bouillet to protect the king's passage. But as the hours passed and the royal carriage failed to appear, the soldiers became a source of tension. In the small towns of rural France, the sight of foreign-looking cavalry waiting around for no apparent reason sparked rumors of an aristocratic plot or an impending invasion. The villagers began to arm themselves with pitchforks and old muskets. By the time the Berlin reached the relay stations, the very escorts intended to save the king were being harassed and blocked by suspicious crowds. The most critical moment of the morning occurred at the town of Saint-Ménéhould. The royal family arrived hours behind schedule. The military escort, thinking the plan had been aborted, had already unsaddled their horses and were resting. As the king leaned out of the carriage window to speak, he was spotted by the local postmaster, a man named Jean-Baptiste Drouet. Drouet was a staunch patriot and a former soldier who had seen the king in person during his military service. As he looked at the face of the valet in the grey coat, his eyes flickered to a small copper coin in his hand, an assignat. The profile on the coin matched the man in the carriage perfectly. The prominent nose, the heavy jaw, the unmistakable eyes of Louis XVI. In that moment, the fate of the French monarchy was sealed not by a general or a politician, but by a commoner with a piece of pocket change and a keen eye for detail. Drouet didn't scream. He didn't call the guards immediately. He waited. He watched the heavy, gold-trimmed Berlin lumber away toward the next town, Varennes. Then he leaped onto his swiftest horse and took a shortcut through the woods, racing to beat the king to the bridge that represented the last barrier to freedom. The Queen's insistence on a grand, slow escape had given the revolution all the time it needed to catch up. The night air in the small village of Varennes-en-Argonne was thick with a chilling mist that seemed to rise from the very soil of France to swallow the hope of its king. It was shortly after 11 o'clock when the massive green and yellow Berlin lumbered to a halt at the edge of the town. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of sweat, expensive perfume, and the mounting anxiety of a family that had been traveling for nearly 20 hours. They were only a few leagues from the safety of the border, yet they had reached a dead end that no map could have predicted. The town was divided by the River Aire, and the royal family had expected to find their fresh relay horses and their military escort waiting for them at the entrance. But the streets were dark. There was no sound of hooves, no clinking of sabres, no welcoming party of loyal hussars. There was only the sound of the wind through the trees and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the exhausted horses that had dragged the Queen's pride across the kingdom. This was the first crushing obstacle of the night. Because of the delays caused by the heavy carriage and the king's leisurely pace, the soldiers sent to meet them had assumed the plan had failed and had withdrawn to avoid arousing more suspicion from the increasingly hostile locals. Louis XVI, dressed in his grey valet's coat, stepped out into the mud. He wandered through the darkness, knocking on doors, asking for the relay station, his voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and a growing primal fear. He was no longer the Sun King. He was a man lost in the dark, looking for a way out of a nightmare that was rapidly tightening around his throat. Behind him, in the shadows of the carriage, Marie Antoinette sat in a stony, regal silence. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and grievances. To her, this delay was not a logistical failure, but a personal insult from a universe that had forgotten its place. She had refused the light carriages that could have cleared this town hours ago. She had chosen the Berlin to preserve the dignity of the throne, and now that very dignity was pinning them to the earth like a lead weight. As the king wandered the empty streets, the psychological pressure began to fracture the royal family's resolve. For Louis, the internal monologue was one of bewildered betrayal. He had spent his life believing in the paternal bond between a king and his subjects. He truly believed that if he could just explain himself, if he could just reach his soldiers, the people would understand that he was not running away from them, but running toward a version of France that still made sense to him. He felt the weight of the crown not as a symbol of power, but as a heavy inherited burden that he was failing to carry. He thought of his son, the Dauphin, sleeping fitfully in the white velvet interior of the carriage, the boy who was supposed to inherit a kingdom, but was instead inheriting a cage. Louis's passivity, his lifelong habit of letting others decide for him, paralyzed him in the Varennes mud. He was waiting for a sign from God, or a command from his wife, or the arrival of a miracle, while the clock of the revolution ticked toward midnight. Marie Antoinette, however, felt the fire of a different kind of desperation. Her heart was not filled with Louis's bewildered sadness, but with a sharp, cold fury. She looked out at the muddy provincial town of Varennes and saw the embodiment of everything she loathed about the revolution. It was small, it was dirty, and it was inhabited by people who dared to question her. Every minute they sat in that carriage was an erosion of her soul. She could feel the gaze of the unseen villagers through the wooden panels. She felt like a trapped animal, yet she refused to behave like one. In her mind, she was still the Archduchess of Austria. If they were to be captured, they would be captured as royals, not as frightened runaways. This psychological refusal to lower herself to the level of a fugitive was her greatest strength and her most lethal flaw. She would not allow the king to abandon the carriage and flee on horseback with the children, a move that might have saved them even then. To do so would be to admit that the revolution had won, that the Queen of France was nothing more than a woman running for her life. The turning point arrived with the sound of a single horse galloping at a breakneck pace through the darkness. It was Jean-Baptiste Drouet, the postmaster who had recognized the king's face on the coin. He had taken a shorter, treacherous path through the woods, driven by a fanatical devotion to the new republic and the thrill of the hunt. He didn't just want to stop a carriage, he wanted to stop history. Drouet reached the town's bridge, the only way across the river, and found it unguarded. He didn't hesitate. He recruited a few local patriots, and together they dragged a heavy cart filled with furniture and old equipment across the bridge, creating an improvised barricade. Then he went to the house of the local grocer and municipal official, Jean-Baptiste Sauce. "The king is at the entrance of the town," Drouet shouted, his voice cutting through the silence of the night like a guillotine blade. "You must stop him." The town of Varennes, which had been a quiet backwater moments before, suddenly exploded into a frenzy of activity. The tocsin, the dreaded alarm bell of the revolution, began to ring from the church tower. It was a sound that every Frenchman of that era knew in his bones. It was the sound of blood, of emergency, of the people rising. Windows flew open, lanterns were lit, and the streets began to fill with men clutching pikes and rusted muskets. The royal carriage, having finally found its way toward the bridge, was intercepted by Sauce and a group of armed citizens. They didn't use force at first. They used the bureaucracy of the New World. They demanded to see the family's passports. The scene was a farce of tragic proportions. Inside the carriage, the Baroness de Corff handed over her papers, which were perfectly forged and signed by the king himself. But the passports were for a party of 6, and the locals were already counting. The tension was thick enough to taste. The smell of the torches, the shouting of the crowd, and the sight of the barricaded bridge told the royal family that the game was changing. Sauce, a man torn between his respect for the old monarchy and his fear of the new law, invited the travellers into his house to wait while the papers were verified. It was a polite arrest. As they stepped out of the berlin and into the cramped, humble rooms of the grocer's house, the reality of their fall began to set in. They were led up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom overlooking the street. The king, the queen, the children, and the king's sister, were now squeezed into a space that was smaller than the Queen's dressing room at Versailles. The air was heavy with the scent of tallow candles and the damp wool of the villagers' clothes. It was here in this claustrophobic room that the final psychological battle for the French monarchy was fought. Louis XV, exhausted and perhaps seeking a way to end the tension, finally broke his disguise. He stood up, his height filling the small room, and looked at Sauce. "Well, yes," he said with a strange, almost relieved dignity. "I am your king." For a moment, the room went silent. The villagers, raised for generations to believe that the king was the father of the nation, instinctively dropped to their knees. Even in the heart of the revolution, the aura of the crown still held a ghostly power. Louis, sensing a shift, began to plead with them. He spoke of his love for France, his desire to protect his family, and his promise to return to Paris once things had settled. He was trying to use his humanity to bridge the gap that his politics had created. But while Louis was pleading, Marie Antoinette was observing the room with a cold, analytical eye. She saw that the villagers were moved, but she also saw the officials in the corner whispering. She knew that every second they spent in this house was a second that the National Guard in Paris was getting closer. The Queen's internal state reached a point of absolute, crystalline clarity. She realized that their only hope was to stall for time until General Boulier's cavalry arrived to rescue them. She began to use her charm and her authority, alternating between being a mother in distress and a queen in command. She asked for food, for water, for a place for the children to sleep, trying to turn the grocer's house into a miniature court where she could control the tempo of the night. But outside, the crowd was growing. Thousands of people from the surrounding countryside, alerted by the tocsin, were descending on Varennes. The sound of their voices, a low, rhythmic rumble of to Paris," began to drown out the king's pleas. The turning point became an irreversible reality when two messengers arrived from the National Assembly in Paris. They carried a decree ordering the immediate return of the royal family to the capital. The flight was now officially a kidnapping in the eyes of the law, even though everyone knew the king had gone willingly. When the decree was read aloud in the small room, Louis looked at the paper, his face pale in the candlelight. He saw the seal of the assembly, the body that had replaced his will with the will of the people. He laid the paper on the bed where his children were sleeping. "There is no longer a king in France," he whispered. Marie Antoinette, however, snatched the paper from the bed and threw it to the floor. "I will not have it soil my children," she cried, her voice cracking with a mixture of pride and terror. In that moment, the mask of the governess was gone forever. She was the queen and she was at war, but the war was already lost. The heavy berlin, the slow pace, the packing of the silver, and the refusal to move with the speed of a fugitive had allowed the revolution to build a wall of human bodies between the king and his army. The bridge was blocked, the soldiers were scattered, and the sun was beginning to rise on a day that would change the world. The royal family was no longer moving toward freedom. They were being prepared for a procession back to the heart of the fire. The Queen's fatal insistence on dignity had brought them to a grocer's bedroom, and from there the path led only to the city of death. The sun rose over Varennes on the morning of June 22, 1791, with a cruel, indifferent brilliance. For King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the light did not bring a new day, but the beginning of a long, slow funeral for the French monarchy. As the massive green and yellow berlin was turned around to face Paris, it was no longer a vessel of escape, but a rolling iron cage. The royal family was forced back into the carriage, but the atmosphere had shifted from the frantic energy of the night to a heavy, suffocating despair. Outside, the crowd had swelled into a sea of tens of thousands. National Guardsmen, peasants with scythes, and radicalized citizens from neighboring villages lined the road. They were not there to cheer. They were there to witness the humiliation of a father who had tried to abandon his children. The good king was gone, replaced in the eyes of the people by a coward and a traitor. The return journey, which would take 4 grueling days, was a psychological torture that no dungeon could replicate. The heat of the June sun turned the interior of the Berlin into an oven. The white velvet upholstery, once a symbol of the Queen's refined taste, was now stained with sweat and the dust of the road. The windows had to remain open to prevent the family from fainting, which allowed the insults and threats of the mob to pour in like a physical assault. People climbed onto the side of the carriage, peering in to spit at the king or scream obscenities at the Austrian woman. At one point, a loyal nobleman who tried to approach the carriage to show respect was torn to pieces by the crowd before the king's very eyes. Louis sat in a state of near catatonic shock, his appetite, the one thing that usually remained constant in times of crisis, finally failing him. He watched the landscape he had once ruled pass by, realizing that every mile they traveled back toward Paris was a mile closer to his own end. Marie Antoinette, however, underwent a transformation that was as terrifying as it was tragic. It is recorded that during those 4 days, the Queen's hair, which had been a vibrant ash blonde, turned completely white from the sheer stress and terror of the ordeal. She sat upright, her spine like a rod of iron, refusing to give the mob the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She clutched her children to her sides, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the horizon. She knew, perhaps better than Louis, that the bridge they had failed to cross in Varennes was the point of no return. By choosing the heavy Berlin, by choosing the silver dinnerware and the white velvet, she had tried to preserve the dignity of the crown. Now, that dignity was being dragged through the mud of every village between Varennes and Paris. The very thing she had fought to keep was the very thing that was being used to hang them in the court of public opinion. When the procession finally entered Paris on the evening of June 25th, the city greeted them with a silence that was more terrifying than any riot. The National Assembly had posted notices throughout the capital. Whoever applauds the king shall be flogged. Whoever insults him shall be hanged. The result was a ghostly, bone-chilling quiet. Tens of thousands of people stood with their hats on their heads, a deliberate sign of disrespect, as the carriage moved toward the Tuileries. The king was no longer a sacred figure. He was a prisoner of the nation. As they stepped out of the carriage and back into the palace, they were not returning to their home, but to their waiting room for the scaffold. The flight to Varennes had shattered the last illusion of the monarchy. Before that night, the people believed the king was being misled by evil advisers. After that night, they knew he was an active participant in his own counter-revolution. The political consequences were immediate. The radical Jacobins, led by Robespierre and Marat, used the king's betrayal to demand a republic. The king was suspended from his duties. The Tuileries Palace became a true prison, with guards watching every move the royal family made, even while they slept. The shadow of the guillotine, once a distant rumor of a new, humane execution device, began to grow long and dark over the royal apartments. In August 1792, the Tuileries was stormed by a mob of sans-culottes, and the monarchy was officially abolished. Louis XVI was stripped of his titles and became simply Louis Capet. His trial in December 1792 was a foregone conclusion. The flight to Varennes was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the proof that he had sought to join foreign armies to slaughter his own people. On January 21, 1793, the man who had once hesitated in the mud of Varennes stood on a platform in the Place de la Révolution. He tried to speak, to tell the people he was innocent, but the drums of the National Guard drowned out his voice. The blade fell, and the head of the last absolute king of France was held up to a cheering crowd. Marie Antoinette's path to the end was even more harrowing. She was separated from her son, her little Dauphin, who was given to a cobbler to be re-educated in the ways of the Revolution, a process that would eventually lead to the boy's death from neglect and illness. The Queen was moved to the Conciergerie, a damp, rat-infested prison known as the antechamber of the guillotine. There, the woman who had insisted on travelling with a silver wine chest was reduced to a single, ragged dress. Her trial in October 1793 was a masterpiece of misogyny and political theatre, accusing her of everything from high treason to incest with her son. She defended herself with a final flash of the royal dignity she had once prized too highly, winning the temporary sympathy of the women in the gallery, but the verdict was already written in the blood of the Revolution. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken to the scaffold. Unlike the king, who had been allowed a closed carriage, she was placed in an open cart, her hands tied behind her back, exposed to the full fury of the Parisian mob. She looked old, thin, and broken, yet she did not flinch. As she mounted the steps of the guillotine, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words were a whisper of the courtly etiquette she had never truly abandoned. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Moments later the blade descended, ending the life of the woman whose pride had cost her a kingdom. The tragedy of Louis XV and Marie Antoinette is not merely a story of bad luck or a postmaster with a coin. It is a story of the lethal gap between power and reality. Louis failed to escape because he could not imagine a world where he was not the father of his people, even as those people were arming themselves to kill him. Marie Antoinette failed to escape because she could not imagine being a queen without the trappings of royalty, even when those trappings were the very things that identified her as a target. Their loyalty to an old world, a world of gold-trimmed carriages and white velvet, prevented them from surviving in the new world of iron and blood. The flight to Varennes remains one of the greatest what-ifs in human history. Had they used the light carriages, had they left an hour earlier, had they skipped the silver and the perfumes, the king might have reached his army. The French Revolution might have taken a different path, perhaps avoiding the Reign of Terror and the Napoleonic Wars. But the weight of the past was too heavy. By choosing the Queen's vision of a royal procession over a desperate flight for survival, the Bourbons didn't just stop for a meal or a change of horses. They signed their own death warrants. They were trapped not by the streets of Varennes, but by the walls of their own minds. In the end, the revolution did not just take their heads. It proved that the monarchy they died for had already ceased to exist the moment they stepped into that oversized, slow-moving carriage. The guillotine was merely the final, sharp period at the end of a long, heavy sentence that they had written for themselves.